Stephen. Good afternoon, everybody. Stephen done a good job of outlining the sort of aims and objectives of the project, and rather than taking time to explain it now, you will hear references to the project and how it came about throughout this presentation, and also with a short video at the end, which will explain it better. I was really concerned before I came here that people weren't going to turn up, because this is the first time that I've been doing things like this for a long time, and this is the first time that I've spoken in my own right without anybody else on the bill or not part of something wider. So it was really great to see that people came. In fact, I came here last year to see the great David Fitzpatrick, Professor David Fitzpatrick, and there's only something like 6 or 7 people turned up, so one up for me. Slightly different presentation than the ones that I would normally do, in that I was thinking about a theme for it, and I wanted to use East Belfast voices from the Great War. So what I've done is, using bits and pieces of my own context, where possible I'm going to allow the men themselves to tell their story. So for my part, there will be a lot of reading, and a lot of maybe funny voices put on from time to time, and colloquialisms. But where possible, I will be trying to allow the men to tell their own story. So excuse me for reading possibly extensively, but hopefully it'll be for the benefit of the wider presentation. But first of all, I'm going to lay some context, and then we'll get into the testimonies themselves. Not so much in chronological order, just whatever way I kind of came across them in my own archive on the computer, and tried to link them together. So, just 10 days before the United Kingdom's decision to engage in conflict with Germany, the East Belfast Regiment of the Ulster Volunteer Force staged what was perhaps their grandest spectacle: a route march through the centre of Belfast, fully armed and accompanied by 2 Colt machine guns and a Maxim gun. It was reported that as many as 5,000 volunteers took part in what was a show of strength that contained all the paraphernalia associated with war. However, it was not the prospect of a European war for which the UVF chose to flex its muscle that summer's day in Belfast. It was the prospect of a war at home. On the same weekend as the Belfast parade, the Irish volunteers successfully landed a consignment of weapons at Howth. Furthermore, the Buckingham Palace Conference had broken down less than 24 hours before. Ireland, and in particular Ulster, stood at the cliff's edge, with the prospect of Home Rule becoming a reality by September of 1914. As the East Belfast volunteers paraded and drilled with weapons throughout their districts, most will have been acutely conscious of the developing European crisis. So too will they have been aware that their military expertise may be required on a far greater stage. Why do I say this? Well, the Belfast Newsletter and the Belfast Evening Telegraph were filled with stories of the situation as it developed. On Monday the 3rd of August, for example, it was reported that, and I quote, "European war has commenced today." This was greeted by great sensation in Belfast, as news spread quickly that the crisis had accentuated in a remarkable manner. Wednesday the 5th of August contained the headline that the Belfast public had been dreading: "War with Germany, 11 o'clock last night." The topic of conversation in Belfast was about the position of the United Kingdom in the ensuing crisis. The streets became filled with people who were waiting to hear any news from London. For some, however, the European crisis was a welcome distraction, and here's our first short testimony. Frank Percy Crozier, a commander of the West Belfast UVF actually, he paradoxically observed how one war was averted at the cost of another. And he said, "There are ominous signs of war, and we are glad. To us, the relief is truly great." Almost sends a chill down your spine, doesn't it? However, the bitter political dispute had not been satisfactorily resolved. The intensity of the religious and political feeling meant that it was almost impossible to deflect all of that energy entirely towards any fresh war effort. John Clark McDermott, another East Belfast man who served in the Great War, who later became Lord Chief Justice for Northern Ireland, said, "If in fact we were saved from a civil war, it was by the outbreak of an even more terrible conflict, which was to bury many of the secrets and uncertainties of the immediate pre-war years. Ulster civil unease this is me speaking now, Ulster civil unease had been suspended in much the same way as the Home Rule legislation itself until after the war. Around 58,000 Irishmen were mobilised on the outbreak of the war. Of those, approximately half were pre-war regular soldiers, and the other half, roughly, were pre-war reservists. Reservists were called up almost immediately, and this applied to those in the volunteer organisations and also those who weren't involved in the volunteer organisations. Around 3,000 reservists departed the Belfast shipyards for active service during this initial period. The industrialised workforce in East Belfast created a dense volume of men in which to recruit from. And it was this factor which set East Belfast apart from the rest of Ireland. Collective pressures for enlistment were particularly effective in industries with stable and well-organised workforces, which is the opposite than what one would expect to be the case. Professor David Fitzpatrick has demonstrated in the first flurry of enlistment, the heaviest flow of recruits and reservists emanated from industries most in demand for war production, and least affected by pre-war unemployment. It is evident that men enlisted for a variety of reasons. As many reasons exist, I would argue, as the number of recruits themselves. Uneventful lives, lack of prospects, the potential for adventure, and a group mentality were as prominent as political motives for East Belfast recruits. An example was East Belfast enlistee John Boyd, who recalled in his diary that when he joined, he was underage, and he didn't join out of any great patriotic instinct, rather because his two friends had already enlisted and he thought he ought to join them. Consideration is owed to the fact that wealth and poverty coexisted in East Belfast at this time. The cramped housing of the Lower Newtownards Road stood in stark contrast to the villas and the detached housing nearby at Strandtown. Much like the housing and living standards, the motives for enlisting would vary depending on which part of East Belfast one resided. The men of Strandtown, Belmont and Knock were, for example, solicitors, accountants, leaders of industry. Far from having uneventful lives and lack of prospects, they were motivated by a sense of duty and a chance to prove oneself in the officer class of the army. One thing which, in my belief, they all had in common was the sentiment of a World War II veteran, whom I heard speaking on the radio recently, who when interviewed stated that he enlisted in the mistaken belief that he could make a difference. A rough estimate would suggest that 10,000 men with a residency in East Belfast saw service during the Great War. The figure of 10,000 would not include those who were born and raised in East Belfast but held a residency outside of the constituency. For example, the many men who emigrated before the war and found service with Australian, Canadian and New Zealand Imperial Forces. The figure would also not include the women from East Belfast who found service with, for example, the Voluntary Aid Detachment, women like Gertrude Annie Taylor from the Belmont area, who died during her role as a VAD in 1916 and is buried in the Belfast City Cemetery. What the figure of 10,000 does represent is a variety of men who served in various units of the Army, Navy and the Royal Flying Corps and later the Royal Air Force. Men like Stoker Matthew Cleland of the Beersbridge Road and Flight Lieutenant Henry Joy McCracken, note the name. He was a descendant of the Henry Joy McCracken, who's on the Strandtown War Memorial. And as a consequence of khaki-tinged hindsight, these men have been relegated to mere footnotes of the conflict. That being said, it is a fact that a vast majority of the service personnel from East Belfast carried out their duty in the khaki attire of the British Army. They found service in each and every Irish regiment, as well as English, Scottish and Welsh regiments. Some of East Belfast's earliest World War I casualties were recorded on the 26th of August 1914 during the opening exchanges of the conflict. Private Hugh Bailey of the 2nd South Lancashire Regiment died of wounds in Belgium on the 26th of August 1914 after being taken prisoner by the German army. Bailey, aged 31, lived at 21 Wolf Street. though he had a connection to 54 Frome Street. He left behind a wife named Sarah who was from Toronto in Canada. Private Bailey entered the theatre of war on the 14th of August 1914 and he was dead within 12 days. Another casualty from East Belfast, another early casualty from East Belfast, was Private John Mccain Sims of the 2nd Royal Enniskilling Fusiliers. He was just 19 years of age. On the outbreak of the war, his family resided at 55 Portello Street off the Woodstock Road. Before the Great War, John worked as a message boy. He was killed on the 26th of August 1914 at the Battle of La Cateau. Private Sims is commemorated on the Craigie Presbyterian Church Roll of Honour and also the Strand Sydenham Presbyterian Church Roll of Honour and also the Strand Town and District War Memorial on the Holyrood Belmont Road junction. Private Sims had two brothers, Robert and Thomas, who also served in the Great War and who were also from East Belfast. Now, not all of East Belfast's casualties during the war were military personnel. Civilians were affected by the war in ways that we don't tend to consider. The RMS Lusitania was a British ocean liner and briefly the world's largest passenger ship. She was launched by the Cunard Line in 1906 at a time of fierce competition in the North Atlantic trade. In May 1915 she was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat, causing the deaths of 1,198 passengers and crew. However, there were some survivors, some of which I was surprised to learn were from East Belfast. Mr. Patrick McGinley was a passenger on the Lusitania and I was on a visit home to his mother who resided at 233 Albert Bridge Road. Mr. McGinley was formerly a teacher at a school in Clonard, but later gained a position in New York in 1910. He was interviewed by the Belfast Newsletter and he said that this was his first visit to his native country since he left. What a visit it was. Describing the terrible events, Mr. McKinley said, and I quote, "I had luncheon at the first table at 1 o'clock and then went on deck and chatted with a gentleman friend. Shortly after 2 o'clock, as I was chatting to my friend, I noticed a white object about 400 yards off the land. It was directly at right angles to the liner. I called my friend's attention to it and he said, 'That appears to me to be a periscope.' No sooner had he uttered those words than a submarine turret appeared on the surface. It remained above water for around a minute and then disappeared again. I saw a white streak coming towards the ship and heard a hissing noise. 'My God, there's a torpedo,' explained the friend. McGinley saw it come quickly through the water and it struck the ship, which shook like a reed in the wind and heaved onto one side. McGinley described the scene as the passengers rushed to the lifeboats and said they were ordered to get out again as the ship, apparently, seemed to be in no immediate danger. The vessel was turned in the direction of Queenstown and just then a second torpedo struck the ship. He went down to his room, secured 2 life belts, he put one on his sister, who was already on a lifeboat, and then he put the other one on himself. He entered the boat, which contained around 100 people. Orders were given to lower all the boats quickly, as the ship was sinking very fast indeed. Something went wrong with a pulley on the boat in which he was, and a young man cut the ropes thinking the boat would fall on its keel in the water. Instead, it turned upside down and they were all precipitated headlong into the water. When he rose to the surface, he felt something on top of his head, and upon putting up his hands, discovered that it was the upturned boat from which he had fallen. With great difficulty, he managed to get from under it, and then started swimming around in the hope of finding his sister. McGinley continued, "The scene as the Lusitania went down, just about 50 yards from me, was awful. There was a deafening explosion, and all the 4 funnels flew out of the ship. In fact, she seemed to burst into pieces as she sank. There was a lifeboat 150 yards from me, upside down, with about 40 people standing on it. I swam over and was dragged aboard. We were on the boat for almost an hour. 7 women and the rest were all men. One of the men had an arm torn almost completely off, and a young fellow severed it for him with a pocket knife. As we were floating about, I saw a lady and gentleman clinging to a piece of raft coming in our direction. When they came near the boat, the lady lifted out one hand and in a piteous voice said, 'For God's sake, save me.' One man on the boat said, 'If we bring any more on the boat, it will go down.' McGinley said, 'I can't see people drown. Let's get them on.' Mr. Wiley, who was a steward, and I helped the lady on, and also the man. Beginning continued. We saw 3 torpedo destroyers coming along at great speed 5 miles off and start to pick up the survivors within a radius of 2 to 3 miles. Then a trawler came over from Conceal Head and sighted our little white signal, and they came towards us. The ship was the Katarina and was flying a Greek flag. They took us all off inside 10 minutes and we arrived at Queenstown at midnight. I was taken to a clothing store, secured clothes, and afterwards I went to Mr. Kavanagh's hotel at Cott Square, where I spent the night. Early in the morning I went to 7 different morgues seeking my sister. I failed to find her, and I went back to the store to get some more clothes. On going into the street, I met my sister a few yards away, and she became quite hysteric on seeing me, and I was absolutely overwhelmed. Another East Belfast survivor of this terrible tragedy was Miss Margaret Mcclintock, who left Belfast 3.5 years previously for New York. She was making a trip home to see her sister, who was living at 3 George's Terrace, Castlereagh Street. Miss Mcclintock stated that the effect of the first torpedo was to cause the ship to heel over to such an extent that the water came over the 3rd deck of the 2nd cabin, just above the dining room where she was sitting at the time. Miss Mcclintock went at once to the starboard side of the vessel to get into a lifeboat, but they saw the first of the boats to be lowered break apart, many people being thrown into the water, perhaps the same boat that Mr. McGinley was on. She was advised to go to the port side, and this she did, though not without much difficulty owing to the extent of the list on the vessel. She managed to get into a boat, and they got clear just in time, thanks to the plucky work of a pantryman who pushed them off with an oar. One of the ladies in the lifeboat drew the attention of a male passenger to the liner as it was sinking, but he refused to turn his head, declaring that he could not look at such a horrible spectacle. There were about 65 people in the lifeboat, and after cruising around for 2.5 hours they were picked up by a trawler, the transferring of the survivors being in many cases a matter of extreme difficulty, owing to the exhausted condition and serious injuries of the people. Later the party were picked up by a government boat and landed at Queenstown about 8:30 p.m. on the Friday evening. The scenes ashore were intensely pathetic. Large numbers of people were wandering about the streets and quays looking for their friends and family. The officials of the Cunard line gave us every possible assistance, while telegrams were sent to relatives and friends to relieve their minds in the cases where information was available concerning survivors. Miss Mcclintock believed that many of the deaths were due to shock and excitement, as she put it. She felt that the stewardesses were splendid and the men did absolutely everything they could. During April 1915, newspapers in Sydney, Australia, contained accounts of fighting with Germans in New Guinea, of all places, in which a naval force from Australia was engaged. Incidentally, they mentioned the exploits of a blue jacket from East Belfast named William J. Faulkner, who allegedly killed 12 natives with his revolver. One of the participants in the encounter, named Sullivan, explained how a German mine under a road was discovered and blown up. And he said, "All this time there was fighting going on all around, the enemy, chiefly natives, being hidden among the branches of the trees. One of our men named Faulkner, nicknamed on board Buffalo Bill, on account of his marksmanship with the revolver, accounted for no fewer than 12 natives with that weapon, fired from the cover of a tree." You can just picture him, can't you? A German prisoner later paid tribute to Buffalo Bill's shooting, and he said, "It was sudden death," he said, "to put one's head above the trench with that man pot shooting around." Sullivan continued, "From the first trench we made a forced march of about 7 miles towards the wireless station. We sighted a second trench, a German prisoner being sent ahead with a blue jacket carrying a white flag to demand surrender. 1 German and 26 natives responded. I, along with others, was placed in charge of these prisoners. There was plenty to drink in their camp, and I gladly accepted the Germans' offer of a mineral water. I drank to the health of good old England, my prisoners looking ill at ease while pulling up their turned moustaches." William Faulkner was a son of Mr. and Mrs. W.J. Faulkner, 61 Fraser Street, East Belfast. His family received a letter from him shortly after the incident, posted from his ship HMAS Warrego at Sydney, where he had been sent after New Guinea. He mentioned that he had brought a few curios from New Guinea, a few souvenirs, and that he was in the best of health. While the war was developing on the Western Front and further afield, the men of the Ulster Division were engaged in training to somehow prepare them for what lay ahead. The 8th Battalion of the Royal Irish Rifles, which contained a large contingent of East Belfast men, were trained at Ballykinler camp in County Down. Tommy Irvine was a soldier with the 8th Battalion, and he recounted his experiences at Ballykinler training camp. And he said, "I mind Ballykinler. It was all full of sandhills and rabbits. We built trenches and we actually thought the Germans would come up from Dundrum. There was a big dog belonged to one of the officers, and one night it came into our tent and we thought it was the enemy. I remember that tent with candles. 8 to a tent and our heads leant out the canvas, and boys, oh, you might get a kick. The uniforms too didn't arrive too soon. I lent my uniform to a friend who had got none, as he wanted it to go home for the weekend. Then we made drains to get the rainwater away, and then we built huts. My friend Billy Mills and I had a great way of harmonising together. As we worked on the huts up on the roof, we put together a song called The Gentleman's Son and the Outcast. We made a stage at Ballykinler, and there were concerts there. We saw the cinema too at Ballykinler for the first time, and they came and took a film of us working there, and I saw myself in the film when they showed it in the cinema a little bit later. Tommy remembered the men's excursions into Newcastle when misbehaviour and fighting were common. Tommy, although one of the smallest men in the battalion, had been a boxer, and so he was chosen to be a military policeman for these trips. He had some rough customers to deal with, it seems. And I quote, "There was a tough guy called Chuck Patton, and there was no prison at Ballykinler, so we fastened him to a pole in the marquee. Some NCOs showed him to some visiting friends one Sunday, but he reared up and nearly pulled the tent down. He escaped one day, handcuffs and all. He got a horse and cart and steered it as far as Clough before they caught him." Tommy was also a piper in the battalion band. He had brought his pipes to the camp one weekend, and an officer asked him and 6 others to be the nucleus of the band which was being formed. He had a busy time as the band headed recruitment marches around Belfast. We went all over Belfast different nights recruiting, left our gear in the Unionist Hall off the Craigie Road. I assume that's the Willowfield Union, or the Willowfield Unionist Club on the Woodstock Road. Men joined up behind us, then the band was thanked for the work that they done. We gave a fellow who drowned in Ballykinler Bay a military funeral too. Fell down steps into the water he did, and his mate was too drunk to save him. I played the Dead March from Saul, and saw all the women crying. In May 1915, the Ulster Division bade farewell to Belfast with a huge parade through the city. In July, they were told to send home their personal and private belongings in preparation to be shipped to the south of England for completion of their training. In camp at Seaford in Sussex with the Ulster Division in 1915, William Anderson sent a number of postcards to his sister, Elizabeth, in Belfast. Before the war, William lived at 29 St Leonard Street, East Belfast. And I'm grateful to Elizabeth's granddaughter and William's great niece, Sylvia Hines, for bringing forward documents to us recently at St Mark's Church in Holyrood Road, and allowing them to be catalogued as part of the project. And one of the postcards read, "Dear sister, just a few lines to let you know I am keeping in the best of health. Hoping yourself and James and wee May are in the best also. There is very nice scenery around here," and he's talking about Seaford. "Very nice scenery around here, and I like the place very well. The weather is pretty good here also. This is a treat of a camp compared to the one we left in Ireland. It is so pleasant that the boys got a holiday on the 12th day, and they enjoyed themselves, I tell you. You would have thought you were in Belfast. They had sashes with them, which they wore, and they got lilies from where I do not know. There was one thing They all kept sober because they had no money. It passed off all right. No more at present, in a hurry to catch the Irish mail. Goodbye for now, Willie. Indeed, Willie survived the war and went on to live with his wife Sarah on the Antrim Road in the north of the city. While we're on the topic of sashes and orangeism, I wish to share a couple of stories which have an orange tinge to them. There's been continual debate amongst historians and also at civic level as to the authenticity of images such as this. You can see the guy with the purple and orange sash there with the pistol. Some have argued that there is a deficiency of evidence to prove that scenes like this would have taken place. But equally, I suppose I would argue that there is also no evidence to suggest that it definitely did not happen. And for that reason, I'll not be trying to settle that particular argument today, but what I am going to do is add to the mystery using the stories of a couple of East Belfast men. Sergeant Samuel Kelling first appeared in the local press in connection with an account of the Battle of the Somme by Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Ricardo. Some of you may have heard that name before. He was the battalion commander of the 9th Enniskilling Fusiliers. Sammy Kelly, as he was known, served in the Boer War with the Enniskilling Fusiliers and was awarded medals for gallantry in that conflict. He had returned to civilian life before the outbreak of the Great War, being in the employment of the Belfast Newsletter for 45 years. Kelly was an enthusiastic member of the Willowfield Battalion of the UVF. He lived with his wife and his family at Dunvegan Street off the Ravenhill Road. On the outbreak of the war, he enlisted with his brother in the 8th Royal Irish Rifles, the East Belfast Volunteers, and was serving at Ballykinler when he secured a transfer to the Tyrone Battalion of the Enniskilling Fusiliers. And this is actually quite significant, I think, because it can help explain some of the unusual service histories that you come across when you're researching these men. If somebody can gain a transfer because of somebody that they serve with in the Boer War, I think it explains a lot for some of the other men that I've come across. Kelly was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, and his citation read, "Kelly took part in the great advance of the 1st of July, volunteered to cross a piece of ground swept by the enemy fire in order to get in touch with the troops on the right of the sector. He achieved his purpose, and later in the day, when all the officers of his company had fallen, he rallied the men and handled the situation with the utmost bravery, working and fighting with untiring energy until wounded." Then, in March 1917, this short article appears in the Belfast Newsletter. "Crossed no man's land wearing an orange sash." And it goes on, "At the main barracks, Enniskillen, on Tuesday, Sergeant Kelly was decorated with his Distinguished Conduct Medal. Son of William Kelly, Madrid Street, and on the 1st of July 1916, crossed no man's land wearing an orange sash, and gallantly and coolly led his men in that terrible charge before Thiepval." So I think at the very least what this story does is prove that the legend of the donning of the orange regalia was certainly not a figment of post-war political and cultural invention, but instead the notion of such stories, whether true or not, existed almost from day one. And perhaps this factor can add some weight to the argument that at least one man, Sammy Kelly, and perhaps a few others, pulled on orange sashes over the top of their khaki tunics. Another first-hand account of the Somme offensive by a veteran called George Hill said, and I quote, "When the barrage lifted on the morning of the 1st, we went over the top in waves. We had practiced it all when out of the line. Some of the lads had got hold of a football and kicked it ahead, shouting, 'Up the Blues' or 'Up the Glens,' which as a Linfield fan living in East Belfast I find quite amusing indeed. But the reason I add this brief observation to the Sammy Kelly story is to show that, I suppose, in times of great uncertainty and strife, we can sometimes revert to the things that give us comfort. Faith in God, orangeism, family, or even love for one's football club. But back to the orange theme, just briefly. More recently, I contacted Number 6 District of the Grand Orange Lodge, who are the East Belfast district, with a view to ascertaining which Orange Lodges existed in East Belfast between 1914 and 1918. The answers contained within the records of Sean Bourke House, which recently went under some transformation, so I wasn't able to access them. So in the absence of this, I requested permission to view the minute books and the roll books of the East Belfast lodges, of whatever they had in their possession. I wanted to know if individual servicemen were discussed at monthly meetings as perhaps being absent, injured, killed. Unfortunately, Number 6 District possessed no form of coherent filing system. Therefore, in order to access the books, which were particularly relevant to me from the years 14 to 18, there needed to be an inventory carried out for all the contents of the so-called boardroom. For 2 days, myself and my colleague Jonathan consulted every single document in that boardroom of the Ballymccarrett Orange Hall in order to label them and eventually separate the ones which we needed to look at. When we eventually found the relevant minute books and roll books, it was certainly worth the wait. In the roll book of a now defunct lodge, South Derry True Blues, LOL 1209, to my surprise, I found a complete list of men from that lodge who served in the Great War. Not only did it provide their name, but also their address, their regiment, their regimental address, their date of enlistment, and also some additional comments. Interestingly, it also recorded dates for which the lodge had written to or sent cards to the men at the front. It also recorded the date of any written reply from the servicemen themselves. In this list there were 34 men in total. Besides the South Derry True Blues list, there were other interesting finds. Lodges expressed sympathy to brethren bereaved by the war. Others made reference to the activities of some of their own brethren at the front. Some lodges were keen to provide support for war widows through their Orange Widows Fund, and in other cases their collections and ballot sales in order to support bereaved families. Some East Belfast lodges were active in sending parcels of comfort to the front, while others discussed the merits of prohibition during the war years. And this is one of the extracts of an organised effort to send parcels to particular brethren at the front. But perhaps the most astonishing find, for me anyhow, was a discussion within the minute book of the Artisans' Temperance LOL, who actually sought to discourage young men from joining the army. Something which in other parts of the country had been viewed as sedition, resulting in jail terms for many Republicans, yet here was an Orange Lodge in East Belfast doing exactly the same thing, albeit for very loyal reasons, I shall see in a second. This was as late in the war as April 1918, and the minute book read, and I quote, "Proposal that the attention of Number 6 District be drawn to the fact that a large number of young Unionist men are joining the army through fear of conscription. To call on all young men to stand fast until the question of Home Rule is settled. No resolution to be sent out to Grand Lodge if the district think fit." This was seconded by Brother J.J. Ferguson, and the lodge closed in time, ironically, for God Save the King. The context here is important. April 1918 was when the so-called conscription crisis in Ireland had come to a head. Enactment of Home Rule was a possibility if military conscription could be achieved in Ireland. But with opposition from the Catholic Church, as well as the Sinn Féin party, who were on the rise, the plans never materialised. However, it does explain the Orange anxiety in East Belfast for both Home Rule and for conscription. Although the Easter Rising was not a tributary of the Great War, the two events were obviously interconnected. Not least in East Belfast, where it seems we quite literally had a hand in the Rising. Captain J.C. Mcclintock of the Royal Irish Rifles received a bayonet wound in the hand during the attack on Jacob's Biscuit Factory. Mcclintock lived at 68 Belmont Avenue. He was a civil engineer by profession and employed by the Belfast Corporation. He was a member of the East Belfast UVF, being Secretary and Company Commander of the Strandtown Battalion. He was the recipient of a service sword from his old volunteer company. Note the fact that a UVF man was engaged in Easter week, and what that says about our notions of one another's history. McClintock had been invalided home due to what was called in the newspaper nervous shock, hence why he came to be deployed in Dublin in April 1916. Indeed, some of the most brutal scarring of young bodies and minds took place not on the Western Front, but much closer to home. Pictured here in uniform with his father David and his grandfather Hugh is Cyril Hugh Mack, who joined the Royal Irish Fusiliers in 1916 and gained a commission at the age of 18 years of age. His first posting did not take him overseas. Instead, Cyril was sent to Dublin, and he is pictured here with other members of his unit at a barricade in Sackville Street, the old O'Connell Street, in Dublin in 1916. It is said that young Cyril found his experiences in Dublin in 1916 profoundly harrowing, and that he was deeply traumatised by having had to shoot and kill a fellow countryman. He went on to serve in Turkey, winning a victory medal, transferred to the British Indian Army, and according to his family, the only physical evidence of Cyril's involvement in the war was a dent in his forehead, which had been caused by a bullet ricocheting off his tin helmet. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Cyril re-enlisted and was stationed at the Officer Training Corps in Omagh. He died in 1963 and is buried in Roselawn Cemetery. There is a video clip here, but I'm not sure if it's going to play or not. I don't think it will. Never mind. In keeping with my theme of East Belfast voices, I want to share with you some extracts of a witness statement from Thomas Tom, as he was known, Wilson, a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, member of the Executive Committee of the Irish Volunteers in Belfast, and crucially for us, a resident of the Albert Bridge Road. And he said, "Close on Easter week 1916, Dennis McCullough attended a meeting in Dublin, and on his return informed me that something serious was contemplated, that the idea of armed camps during Easter week, during the Easter week period in Tyrone for training purposes, was only part of the contemplated programme. Any person connected with the volunteers should know that a rising was imminent from the preparations being made." He goes on to explain how the Belfast volunteers were to mobilise in Coal Island, and from there they were to make their way across the Shannon to join up with Liam Mellows and his volunteers in Connaught. However, confusion and mismanagement eventually scuppered the plans, and they found themselves back in Belfast by Easter Sunday evening. On Monday morning, I turned up to my work as usual and did not notice any particular activity by police or military. All during Easter week, the volunteers kept quietly in contact. Mr. McCullough was not moving about at this time, and his absence seemed to leave the volunteers in a confused position. We usually travelled out of the city to the end of the tram lines and there discussed the situation more generally. There was no possibility of doing anything, and discussing the matters did not seem to serve any useful purpose. Early in the week following Easter week, there was a general roundup by the RIC in Belfast, and I was arrested at my work. I was taken to Newton Ards Road Police Barracks, and from there I was taken to Crumlin Road Prison. I met all the leading Belfast volunteers in the prison. After 2 days in Crumlin Road, we were loaded onto furniture vans and taken by train to Dublin. We were marched from Amiens Street to Richmond Barracks. When in Richmond, I saw Sean McDermott, one of the signatories of the proclamation, being taken out for his court-martial. I also saw him later being taken away for execution. Tommy Irvine, our friend from earlier, was a skilled man with a bayonet and was useful to any patrol that was going to make contact with the Germans. He would blacken his face for camouflage reasons and take a supply of Mills bombs as well as a rifle and a bayonet. And I quote, "I was a PP man, a permanent patrolman, and one night I went out with Jack McVicker, an ex-boxer, and a fella called Skates. I was bayonet man on the raiding party. I went in front. Each man had his duty. We went along this traverse of a German trench, but we made noises in the water with our waders. Skates jumped up in the parapet and went along and took the pin out of a grenade and threw it ahead at a bunch of Germans round the next corner. We came round and found them. Oh, it was a pitiful sight to look at them. Then there was a dugout with 60 or 70 steps down into it. Someone threw a couple of Mills bombs down before they could get out, and they were cut to pieces down there. Well, 3 or 4 was alive and could walk, so we brought them back. We didn't like to shoot them. We couldn't just go and murder a man. But we had to get away quick because of the noise of Sammy's bombs alerted them. They sent up flowers after us, but we got back okay. In order to give a flavour of how East Belfast men experienced Christmas at the front in 1915, I've turned to the battalion war diaries. All units of the size of an infantry battalion, cavalry regiment, artillery brigade and above were obliged to maintain a record of their movements and activities. These records are called war diaries. The 8th Battalion, the East Belfast contingent of the Ulster Division, war diary at this time was scribed by Lieutenant Colonel Pelly, who was the commanding officer. And I want to show you some extracts from it in the lead up to their first Christmas in 1915. 13th of December, relieved by the 9th Royal Irish Rifles, marched to billets at Vatten. 14th of December, in billets, lecture on Cromwell's campaign in Flanders by Professor Fletcher. 18th of December, Rifleman J. Townley and A. Gillespie wounded. 19th of December, Rifleman J. Townley died of wounds and was buried at Mealy Mallet. Cross was erected. 21st, to trenches occupied right sector, 2nd Royal Irish Regiment to the right of the battalion, 9th Royal Irish Rifles left the battalion. 22nd December, in trenches, weather very bad, Rifleman S. Muirhead and J. McKinstry wounded. 23rd December, in trenches, weather very bad, our artillery carried out a bombardment, Germans retaliated, there were no casualties on our side. 24th of December, in trenches, weather extremely bad, flooded trenches everywhere. 25th of December, in trenches, Christmas Day, Lewis Gunn under 2nd Lieutenant Abernathy caught a small party of Germans emerging from a sap, thought to be a working party. 2 of the party were seen to fall. No greetings were exchanged. Opened fire at every opportunity. Relieved by the 1st Battalion, the Royal Irish Fusiliers. In billets, had a Christmas for the men. Free issue of beer on Boxing Day 1915. In January 1916, not long after the 16th Irish Division had reached the front, a correspondent of the Irish News travelled to France in order to compile a report for the newspaper. While spending time with the Irish Division, he learned that a section of the Ulster Division were located close by. This juxtaposition of the Irish regiment struck him as being eminently interesting and a significant one. He described how he had the opportunity of talking to a fatigue party of the Royal Irish Rifles belonging to the Ulster Division. He introduced himself, a journalist with the Irish News, remember, and received a hearty welcome, both as a fellow countryman and as a fellow citizen of Ireland. The troops told him of the recent death of Lieutenant MacDermott, the son of the Reverend Dr. MacDermott of Belmont Church, which had occurred just 2 days previously at a spot quite close by to where he had left. The men gave him several individual messages to convey home to Belfast. They were in good fettle, as the journalist said, and looked remarkably hardy and fit after their experiences. A non-commissioned officer from Mount Pottinger added in jest, "Any word of home rule at home now, sir?" The journalist replied in the same spirit, "No, not since you people left." With a great deal of good-humoured chaff, they conducted him to a stable-like structure where they are billeted. The journalist asked them about the Dublins and the Royal Irish, and he received assurances that they were all in fact pals. "Does not matter what you are out here," said one of the men from East Belfast. "We are all in it, and we're all doing our best." The journalist felt that this represented the spirit which has been engendered by encounters with the potent and common enemy. The men of the Ulster Division with whom he spoke that evening were all from East Belfast, and they shared in the prevailing cheerfulness which trench duty seems to induce. So far as these particular men were concerned, they do their days in and they do their days out, which is the alteration of trench duty. With the uncomplaining spirit of hard-bitten troops and their Belfast sense of direct and sometimes sardonic humour has not deserted them in the warlike atmosphere of France. The Irish news correspondent was then given a hearty send-off from them as the motor car sped away. John Boyd, who we met earlier in the presentation, he enlisted with the army in 1915 as an underage boy, and he freely admits in his diary that it was not out of any great sense of patriotism, but because his two friends had already done so. His battalion was the 14th Battalion of the Royal Irish Rifles, recruited mostly from the pre-war young citizen volunteers. They travelled to the front in October 1915, and Boyd goes on to describe some fairly mundane activities in the opening weeks. For example, walked 9 miles to billets, and then soon after they walked 14 miles to billets, as he says in his diary. John Boyd didn't see a trench until the last few days of October. In fact, he mentions that he spent Halloween in the trenches. Furthermore, we have this perception that the men spent 4 years sort of constantly in a trench. In fact, this was not the case. Boyd's 14th Battalion would eventually settle into a routine where they would be in and out of the trenches 4 to 6 days at a time. Life behind the lines could be relatively comfortable. In November, Boyd described being billeted in a house belonging to a French soldier who was at that moment in time serving at the front. In December, he again described staying in a fairly comfortable house. There also appears to have been a fair degree of football played. Boyd describes inter-company matches as well as inter-battalion matches, for example, a defeat by the 10th Battalion Enniskilling Fusiliers, and also a 1-1 Boxing Day draw with the 11th Battalion Enniskilling Fusiliers. In fact, according to his diary, December appears to be a month saturated by football. Boyd doesn't give much description of what life was like inside the trenches. And when he eventually does, it turns out to be a positive picture that he paints. I quote, "Went into support trenches on Easter Monday. Unique experience for a holiday time. It's a very good dugout in a wood for 6 days. Great place." What struck me about Boyd's account was the monotony of the war and the boredom of war. Also that the war seemed to occur around him as if he were an amateur actor who had suddenly and unexpectedly found himself on stage at the West End in London. By July 1916 he would, however, be required to play a crucial role in this drama. Boyd described his role on the 1st of July 1916 as his battalion followed the 11th Enniskilling Fusiliers over the top. After heavy fighting and heavy losses, he remembered asking his corporal for the time, his corporal being the only one with a watch. He said it was 7:30 p.m. In other words, Tom Boyd had been in action for 12 hours without a rest. The corporal indicated that they would soon be relieved. Some hope, John reckoned in his diary. John was hit by a machine gun round shortly after the exchange with his corporal. This was around 8 p.m. The corporal bandaged his arm, sent him backwards towards their own trenches. He had to cross no man's land no less than 3 times in order to do so. He eventually returned to safety and then to an aid station where he was tended to by a Canadian nurse. I returned to a cup of tea and a round of bread and jam. Absolutely the best meal I've ever eaten, especially after months of hard biscuits and bully beef. John Boyd's diary then comes to an abrupt end. Landed at Boulogne on Monday, arrived Oxford Hospital 4th of July. At this point we can presume that John Boyd's war ended. Back to Tommy Irvine. On the 1st of July 1916, Tommy had spent the previous night beside as he described it, a big sandy-haired fellow with whom he had once boxed on the Beersbridge Road in East Belfast, and chatted to him until both men managed to fall asleep for a short while. The East Belfast men were last to leave for the German lines. Tommy Irvine was in one of the latter waves of that battalion, and just ahead of him was the sandy-haired fella from the Beersbridge Road, beside whom he had slept the night before. He came falling, stumbling back into the trench beside Tommy. At first, Tommy could not see what was wrong. Then the man opened his mouth and blood spurted out in regular beads. Tommy grabbed him and held him, and the blood soaked into his tunic. He pushed back the man's helmet, discovered a long, deep split in his forehead, caused by shell fire. Tommy and another soldier dragged the wounded friend to one side and prepared to go over straight away themselves. Tommy, as he ran over no man's land, felt a stinging heat on his shoulder but thought nothing of it. Later he realised he had been hit by shrapnel. When he got to the German lines, he joined the other Belfast men in helping consolidate the gains already made. Tommy had come back up the trenches from Grand Court and Thiepval. Others emerged from dugouts. Tommy threw his grenades down a dugout as if he were throwing a cricket ball, as he remembered it, and shouted, "Divide that amongst yous." Still there was confusion all around. Somebody shouts, "Go that way," and so I did. Sure enough, somebody got me in the leg, so I made for him, a German, and I got him, shot him in the face. Then I tried to walk back and I couldn't. I had been shot. A big fella called Andy Robb pulled me back. I'd like to have got in amongst them Germans with my bayonet because they mowed us down like pieces of wood. It was terrible. It was cruel. Tommy was badly enough injured to be brought in by the stretcher bearers. His fighting career was over. To Tommy, regaining consciousness and clarity as one of the wounded, it appeared that he was receiving more fuss than he deserved. Although he had 2 wounds, one on the shoulder and one on the leg, much of the blood on his clothes was not in fact his. It belonged to the comrade who had fallen back into his arms, mortally wounded early the previous morning. This, plus the chalky mud of the Picardy soil, combined to make him look an absolute mess, as he recalled it. Tommy could clearly hear a French voice repeat over and over again, "Pauvre garçon, pauvre garçon." Soon he was taken by train to a hospital where they operated on his leg. I just want to finish with a short, less than 10-minute video regarding a collection of letters which were found in County Cavan, and they are connected to the St Mark's Church, Dundela, just off the Hollywood Road, and the documentary adequately explains everything about them, but you will hear our sort of final East Belfast voices from the war today.
At the bottom of an old tea chest in a former bishop's house in Cavan, the lid was lifted on a piece of history from the First World War. Inside, in a dusty envelope, 10 letters were discovered, written by soldiers at the Western Front. It's Christmas 1917. The letter writers in the trenches are from the parish of Dundela in East Belfast. They write home to their rector and the parishioners, thanking them for sending out parcels of comforts.
109th Field Ambulance, British Expeditionary Force, 2nd of February 1918. Dear Mr. Barton, I have just received the parcel from St Mark's containing comforts, for which I send my many thanks. I need hardly state how useful these little things are out here, where the weather conditions vary so much and where one has not always a very enticing place in which to spend his hours on duty. However, we can only carry on, hoping that this will be our last year out here, and that next Christmas and New Year will be spent in the more congenial atmosphere of our own homes. Again, thanking you for your useful gifts and trusting that Mrs. Barton and yourself are enjoying good health. I remain sincerely yours, Ernest P. Palmer.
The envelope containing the letters was poignantly marked "Soldiers' Presents" by the man who received them, Reverend Arthur Barton, rector of Dundela during the war. He kept them safe, along with other memorabilia from his time there, and brought them with him when he became Bishop of Kilmore in 1930.
And we learn from the letters how he is providing almost a service, going around the community, looking after almost the wives and the children of the men who are at the front. And as a serviceman, I suppose you could ask for nothing more from a minister than to provide that service back at home and to put your mind at ease while you have other things on your mind.
Today they are safely housed in the representative church body library, where a group of local researchers from the East Belfast and Great War project have come to see them for the first time.
The project started for us in 2013, just at the tail end of last year. Although it began for me as a personal journey back in 2009 at Queen's University when I wrote a dissertation called East Belfast, the UVF and the Great War. The three main elements of the project which I have identified are the database, which will go online, and we want to have that online and searchable for the general public in 2016. We also have a community engagement aspect where we want to transfer our skills and empower community groups to be able to carry out their own research on the Great War, and we feel that that's very important. And the third element is the book itself, which we want to write a book which will tell the story of the Great War, but from the perspective of the men and women from East Belfast.
The letters are significant because they are the only known letters by men from East Belfast to survive. There's expectation when the file of Barton's Dundela papers is opened for the first time.
Shirley and Jason, this is the file of Arthur Barton's letters from his time in Dundela that we found in the Sea House in Kilmore. At the end of the letters from the soldiers in the envelope in which they were. But on top of that, there was other material, treasured things that he had from his time as rector, service sheets, the ladies' club, that kind of thing. So you'll find those first, and then at the bottom, the envelope, and then the 10 letters from the trenches.
Then they examine the envelope and 10 letters
You
themselves.
see the envelope in which all of the letters were originally folded up.
Did you originally discover these?
Yes, this is the envelope which we took out at the bottom of the tea chest with everything else. And it did strike a chord because you can read out there what it's just on the back, what his annotation.
It says soldier's presence. You can only imagine what you thought when you read that, what was going to be inside.
What's inside. So the first letter there written in pencil, because that's presumably all that the writer had to hand. A very poignant date. And his writing he just puts somewhere.
26th of January, 1918. Somewhere. Dear Sir, I take the pleasure and opportunity of writing you these few lines to let you know I received your parcel of comforts all right, for which I send you my very best thanks. They will come in very useful at the present time, for the weather here now is very cold. It helps to lift one's heart a bit when they get something from their friends at home. I have nothing more to say just now, so I close again thanking you for your kindness. Yours sincerely, J. Mccain.
So this one's very evocative. The first thing you see here is active service, so you're in no doubt that this is conflict related.
On active service, France, to the rector and members of St. Mark's Church, Dundela, I thank you all for your kind thoughts of me, and also for the very useful box of comforts you sent. The box contained just the things that are needed, I think most, by the men in the trenches. Socks are in great demand when the weather is bad and mud is everywhere, and the mitts and woolen headgear are desirable, if not essential, when the weather is cold. We had both kinds of weather on our last trip in the line, so you can imagine how thankful I was that your parcel had arrived the day before the battalion went into the trenches.
So we can see here that it's the 28th of January 1918, and as the men were writing these letters on the front line. The people back home in Dundela had just completed their Christmas and their New Year as prepared by Arthur Barton.
And it's taken until the end of January for the parcels which they had made up in build-up to Christmas and as part of their Christmas celebration, if you will. It's taken before Christmas to January for them actually to receive them and then have the time to respond and say thank you.
This one's very easy to read, actually. It's by R.A. Bruce, and I believe that's Robert Bruce. Please convey my sincere thanks to the parishioners of St. Mark's for their very useful and much appreciated gift, which arrived safely. Often think of the many happy hours I had in the choir, and hope that, God willing, I shall one day return there and renew old acquaintances. So he's very much thinking of home.
The content of the letters conveys the awfulness of the conflict. So clearly the discovery of these letters is important for reconstructing local history and the contribution of these men to the Great War effort.
There's nothing quite compares to getting your hands on the authentic real documents, especially as a keen researcher and a historian. It reminded me almost of going to see the old newspapers in Belfast in the newspaper library. It doesn't quite compare to seeing them on the computer screen, you know, and I don't think the men who wrote these letters would have imagined 100 years ago me travelling from Belfast to the RCB library in Dublin in order to get these letters out of the archive and be so impressed by them and interpret them and speak about them and their context in the Great War.
That's a wee taster of something bigger that we're actually working on. So since then, that was recorded this time last year, we've continued the research into the letters and we've discovered some incredible things. For example, most of the letter writers survived, by the way. I think they all survived actually. But one who we traced right through was in the Home Guard then during the Second World War and died literally on his own doorstep during the Blitz. So after coming through the Battle of Cambrai and things like that, the Germans eventually caught up with him on his own doorstep. And another man is the relative of a current coach at Linfield Football Club, so we're now getting Linfield involved in the project and we're hoping to do a feature-length thing maybe for RTE or something. Thanks for coming, thanks for listening to me and bearing with me as I kind of trundled through that, and I hope to see you all again in the near future at another event by East Belfast in the Great War. Thank you.